Hey guys, welcome to The Bottom Half is Red. I'm your host, Barron Longstreth, and I am excited to bring to you a show that is going to give you some thought-provoking discussions. It's going to give you some expert insights to both encourage and some practical steps for how to build an organization that can more effectively introduce the world to Jesus Christ. So what is The Bottom Half is Red? It's all about building a culture of excellence. It's about growing your unique and creative identity. And it's about carrying out the will of God at any cost. So you're going to see that through practical teaching tips, developing a culture of giving, creating branding and marketing, or even methods to help guests feel safe and welcomed. This podcast is going to have you covered. But before we dive into today's episode, I want to take just a moment and extend a special invitation to all of our dedicated listeners. If you're looking to get even more involved in our community and gain some access to some behind-the-scenes stuff, become a Patreon supporter. And you can find that link in the episode description or even on Patreon. Just visit The Bottom Half is Red. Listen, we can't wait to welcome you on board and to share this exciting journey. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Well, welcome back to The Bottom Half is Red. I am your host, Barron Longstreth, and I have in studio with me David Tanderup, who makes the show run. We appreciate him and his efforts. He is talented beyond his willingness to share, and we're very thankful for all of his efforts in The Bottom Half is Red. And I have Dan and Hailey MacLeod, who you're going to hear from today, and you are going to be blessed on this episode. I'm going to make this more of a free-flowing episode. In this episode, you're going to see a ministry couple and their experiences. Stay tuned to an excellent episode. You're going to love it. Dan, introduce yourself to The Bottom Half is Red. I'll tell you that you've been my friend for how long now? How long have we been connected?
Oh, man.
15, 16 years?
Yeah,
we met
something
on
like that.
Twitter through Brother.
Yeah, Jim
Poitras.
Poitras used to tag us in tweets.
Yeah.
And then at a general conference, probably
You and Justin went and were on a panel with
13
them.
or 14 years ago, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, it's been
We had breakfast
at General
at
Conference.
general conference.
And it
That was
just
the first time we met
stuck.
in person, and it was just a God thing.
Yeah, it stuck. And then I'll let Dan and Hailey tell you about their journey, but it's been back and forth across the border, and we'll talk about that. And they're here in Tulsa visiting. They got their kids. They've got 3 boys, and I'll let them explain that. Hailey is extremely talented as well. You're going to hear from her.
Go on.
Yes, I will. I just go on and on. Send me that bio. Send me that bio of yourself. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh my goodness, I thought he was serious. I'm like, what bio?
Send me that bio that you wrote of yourself.
That's right.
So we're going to kick this thing off. Dan, Hailey, work together as a great married couple and give us the beginning of your journey.
All right. Well,
You're going to say age before beauty, aren't you?
I know no numbers.
Before we start with our story, can I just say that if there's any church planters listening, it's very important to find yourself another couple like Barron and Raina Longstreth, maybe in your same season, and surround yourself with people of excellence, people that love God, and people that will inspire you to be passionate and listen to great podcasts like The Bottom Half is Red.
Yeah, and I would say not just church planners, ministry in general. We met in 2007. I had been raised around the church, but had never really had my own experience with the Lord, and had received the Holy Ghost in May of 2007. And almost immediately, the Lord began giving me dreams of what the future would look like in terms of ministry. And so I'd gone to my pastor at the time and began to talk to him about this change of direction. And I was in the middle of a secular degree at a university with the aspiration of being a lawyer one day. When I spoke to my pastor about this change of direction and desire to go to Bible school, I mean, he was just 100% behind it. And so 4 months after receiving the Holy Ghost, that's what I did. I embarked on a journey of ministry development and Christian education. There's a small Bible school, Northeast Christian College in New Brunswick, Canada, where I grew up. And so I was moving in. I think it was Labor Day weekend or the weekend after Labor Day in early September of 2007. And
the beautiful ladies'
pretty
dorm
little lady
supervisor came over to unlock the door for you.
And the rest is history.
That's an interesting point, the ladies' dorm supervisor. So you had been there prior.
I was working at the Bible school at that time. I'd already worked there for a year and had graduated, and then went on and did some community college and came back to work at the Bible college, not thinking that I was going to meet a man that was 5 years my junior who I would eventually marry one day. Yep.
I left the age out, but she just went in.
It's okay.
So what year were you guys married then?
The next year, less than,
we're actually married a year,
less than 365 days later.
Just a couple of weeks less than a year after we met. So we met in early September 2007, and we were married August 22nd, 2008.
Wow.
And he was 19, which to me now is laughable, but at the time seemed...
Yeah, admittedly, people thought we were crazy, I think. Yeah. Even my own parents probably.
Yeah. I got married 5 days into 20, so I'm familiar with that, what that looks like. So you got married. Where did you go from there?
So we were married, and that was at the conclusion of my first year of school. It was a 3-year program.
Okay.
And so we remained in Fredericton while I finished schooling, and Haley worked. We were very involved with Capital Community Church, where Pastor Woodward was leading at the time. The associate pastor was Jack Lehman. So we were very connected with them and just served locally. While being in Bible school, that also opened some ministry opportunities to travel a little bit, but we were pretty invested locally. And then in that season, there was a gentleman that had actually moved to Fredericton the same month we moved. He had not come to school, but had returned to be youth pastor for Brother Woodward. Ironically, he and Haley had attended Bible school together years prior, so they had a pre-existing relationship or friendship, and we just kind of hit it off immediately. Again, he was 11 years older than me, actually. We laugh about it because, I was in the process of God taking my hair, and he still had his, so the 11-year age gap didn't seem so big.
It's true.
But it was just another one of those God connections and hit off a friendship, and that was Justin McKenzie.
Yeah.
And so at the time, Jay was not married, but in his tenure of youth pastor there, met Grace Benshovel, who was from Wisconsin, and they were married, and she moved to be with him in Fredericton. And so, at that stage of our journey, it was really it was a friendship, it was a relationship. We spent a lot of time together, had a lot of fun, and then would have been February of 2009. I was in a chapel service at the Bible school when, the Lord spoke to me. And, up until that moment in time, I would say, I knew what it was for God to speak to me in terms of general direction. I knew I had a call to ministry. I knew the Lord had led me to this Bible school. But never had I had the Lord speak to me something so clearly in terms of, place or timing as it pertains to this is a life decision. We're not talking about a little season of education. This is a major life decision. How does God speak to you? A couple things, the Lord will often speak to me visually. And so in that instance in particular, I could describe the room to you, the carpet, the pews, where the windows were. I was laying in the aisle on the right side of the chapel and, laying on my face. And I saw a vision of a city, almost like I was in a drone flying over a city. And there was just this overwhelming burden, responsibility, but at the same time a peace. And I knew what the city was. It was Halifax. And the witness of the Spirit, Paul says that, this about the Lord. He said his Spirit bears witness with our spirit. And so there's this internal witness, and I think that comes in many ways. On the one hand, it's a burden, but on the other hand, it's a peace. There's a joy. There's an excitement. All this is turning in my spirit. You think of walking into a corporate worship service and kind of the flood of emotions you can have depending on what the song is. And it's very similar to that, but it's all internal. But I had to get this out. And so Haley was at work, And the Bible school was right next to the church. And so I had left the school when we finished chapel and walked over to the church. And Justin was in his office there at the church. And I went in just as a friend. And I said, man, I got to talk to you about something. And he said, what? And I said, the Lord just called me to Halifax. He was like deer in the headlights. He was stunned. Now, Jay was born and raised in Nova Scotia and had come to work with Brother Woodward for a season, but it was always his intention to go back. And ironically, prior to Hailey and I ever meeting, she had spent time in Nova Scotia.
Can I just say something?
You can always say something.
Just inserting that 6 years previous to the Lord calling him, that God had put something in my heart for Nova Scotia. So I had already volunteered at a church there for the summer, worked with brother and sister men and their youth. And during that time, I had someone prophesy over me that I was called to Nova Scotia and that I was going to go there and I was going to plant churches. But I had filed it away 6 years earlier and had never even really talked to Dan about it. Just kind of well, if it's God, it's going to happen. And if it's not, it's not. And so fast forward to 6 years after that.
So, all this had happened without my knowledge. I mean, she'd never even shared this in our discussions pre-marriage, after marriage. She kind of, I think probably had resolved, that was a good man, but he just missed it. That word wasn't accurate. Well, then the Lord speaks this to me. I'm talking to Jay, and then what I did not know at the time was Brother Woodward had been talking to Jay about going back to Nova Scotia earlier than initially planned. So this conversation between Brother Woodward and Justin had happened within 1 or 2 weeks prior to me walking into Justin's office this day.
Wow.
And so he's stunned. And I don't know that this conversation has existed. And so we're talking through this. And then we come home one day, Hailey's home, and Justin says to Hailey, what are you going to do next year when you're done school, when Dan done school? She said, well, I don't know. Maybe we'll go back to his hometown. And I know the pastor there would like us to come help them. And we're sitting there. And he said, well, what would you think about going to Nova Scotia and starting a church? Well, she's like,
yes.
She's stunned
1,000
because
times yes.
There's this word in her past from 6 years prior. She had spent time there with the men's who founded the district and started 7 churches in Nova Scotia. Her and Jay had a friendship from Bible school, and now I'm in the picture. We're newly married, and there was this word the Lord had given me. And so, to look back, you could not manufacture this.
Yeah.
God had orchestrated it without question. And so that was near the end of my second year of school. I finished my third year. I actually got an exemption to leave school a month early because we had an opportunity to move to the city that would help us financially. And so on March 31st, 2010, we pulled into the city of Halifax. We had a 24-foot U-Haul. Justin and Grace had the first 12 feet, and we took the last 12 feet because we were able to get into our apartment a day before they could get into theirs. So it was God. You could not look back and you could not have manufactured it.
Okay, so now you're there. You're married. You're there. Now give us a highlight, because I want to talk about not just your experience in Halifax. I want to talk about your experience beyond that. And I won't get ahead of you guys telling your own story, but it's pretty phenomenal how God took you there and then where God has taken you from there.
We arrived in Halifax, March 31st, 2010, with the dream and the intention to start a church. And quite honestly, no idea how to do that.
It's funny that you can go to Bible school for 3 years, and then when you actually have to put legs on starting a church, it's like, where do you start?
How much influence organizationally did you guys get? Was there hey, these are the A, B's, and C's of starting a church plant within your own district, and these are some of the things, some pitfalls?
In those early years, very little.
Yeah.
Once we were 2-3 years in, God was kind to us, and even the organization internationally was kind to us. There was funding we did receive for a few years. The current NAM director visited us on 2 or 3 different occasions.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was very kind of him.
Yeah.
But
The district was smaller, so it's a different dynamic when you go into a small district with not as many resources. It's Canada, it's just a different landscape than you have in, say, the Midwest or the South.
From arrival to, to get going, probably a year and a half, 2 years. Those first 2 years were extremely difficult for many reasons, not just the financial component, which was very tough personally, but also the
spiritual
component. Yeah, most definitely. And the just not knowing what to do. Very little support system, very little help, which honestly in the moment was frustrating, but looking back, I'm grateful for.
Right.
Brother Woodward was very much of the opinion, like, we'll help you get some sound gear when you get going, but just go figure it out.
Which I think is a real benefit now.
I'm going to push you out the deep end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're going to learn how to swim in the water. And it was frustrating in the moment. It really was. But looking back, especially, I'm thankful that there is a momentum surrounding the conversation of church planting now, and that many people who do it today are privileged to start from a standpoint of blessing. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't balance the conversation a little bit by discussing the challenges from starting from that perspective. I don't know that I could adequately articulate what that perfect balance is, because there's so much nuance based probably on the individual in the city. But I guess that the principle is, and this is not pretty to preach. It's even less pretty to live. But man, you have to suffer.
Yeah.
I remember Brother Woodward saying to us one time, he said, you overestimate what you can do in 2 years, but you will underestimate what you can do in 10 years. And the premise was, you go so eager to build a church, but really God's building a man.
Right.
Man, he let us suffer. It is not pleasant in the moment. Like, it's not comfortable. It's not fun. But, I tell people all the time, everywhere we go, talking about our story, who we are, anything we have to give, it comes from 10 years in Halifax. That was my decade of 20s. We arrived at 21. That decade of my life was God building me, building the man. And you just have to suffer. Even the scripture says, obviously we know Jesus was perfect, sinless, but the scripture says the captain of our salvation was made perfect or complete through suffering. In his humanity, there is a maturity that must be brought about in order for the ministry to be fulfilled. And the only way maturity comes is through suffering.
Right.
And I think sometimes when you are privileged, and I don't fault anyone, you would be a fool to say no to help. You would be crazy to turn down money. But when you operate from a standpoint of blessing, and sometimes you have the privilege to live in an incubator that protects you from suffering. It sounds strong, and I don't mean it to be, but I'm just concerned that we get accustomed to shallow and superficial. And perhaps I didn't know these men. I didn't know J.T. Pugh. I didn't know C.M. Becton. I didn't know James Kilgore. I didn't know Kenneth Reeves or T.W. Barnes, or I didn't know Verbal Bean. But I'm telling you, when you listen to those men speak, there was not a charisma of personality that would have them on platforms in 2024.
You're right.
But man, there was a depth of character. There was a substance in their spirit. Well, I'm going to tell you what the common denominator was. Those men suffered.
Yeah.
Well, I think something too we benefited from, which I just wanted to insert, is the bishop of the district had come to Halifax or to Nova Scotia in 1952. Am I right? He came with his wife who was pregnant, and they came with a U-Haul, or they came with their truck, which was full of all their stuff. And right after they entered the province, they had some problems with the truck. They stopped. Their truck caught on fire. and everything they had began to burn before them. And they sat on the side of the highway. And Bishop said, we lifted up our hands and we praised God because there's something in our soul that fire can't burn. And I think hearing those stories from him kind of put something in us where we thought, you know what? As bad as it is, like, we know that growth comes through suffering, and it doesn't mean you have to live there forever. But, you know, there was a prophecy over my husband when we first came, and it was like, you know, as a seed, you've got to fall into the ground and you've got to die. Mm-hmm. Something has to be planted. It's called a church plant. But whatever's planted almost, you know, can't grow unless it goes through the process. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think being exposed to, like you said, some elders and going back to our roots and looking and saying, you know, we can have all the stuff. We can have great media presence. We can have great music. But what does it take to build a great church? And I don't think you can get around sacrifice.
You know, the highlight of those 10 years, obviously, I should mention, God gave us 3 sons in that season, and Carson, Sawyer, and Finn. And I remember when Carson was born in 2011, we had been there about a year and a half, had been having Sunday services for 9-10 months. A great Sunday is 10 to 15 people. I mean, it's
awesome.
That's like a youth congress to us.
Oh, yeah.
You know it.
We celebrated those moments.
And
yes.
These are people that know nothing about Pentecost.
Right.
Expressive worship, brand new to them. Speaking in tongues, brand new. And I remember looking at my newborn son in a car seat on the front row, and in my mind, battling, thinking, we just left a church of 400 people where there's powerful altar calls. People jump and shout. They pray out loud. They dance. And I'm looking at my son in this room where these people know nothing. And the atmosphere is so different than what we came out of. And I'm wondering, will he ever know what it's like? You know, will he know what it's like to be in a church where people experience what I know this should be like? Well, thanks be to God, he does. Mm-hmm. And God, you know, by God's grace, there is a powerful church in Halifax, Nova Scotia today.
And talk about that. I know I was there. I saw the journey together, but talk about the uniting of that. And I think this will spark us into the next phase of your guys' journey. So give us insight on that.
So those first 6 years, you know, there were high points, some people's lives that were touched by God, but man, it was a fight. But in September of 2014, a man was preaching for us, and we were meeting in a hotel conference room. And near the end of the service, he prophesied several things. One of those things was, God is going to give you $1 million building that you did not build and you will not pay for. Well, let me tell you, there have been some suffering, but I could shout about that.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as we suffered, we never surrendered our faith. And, you know, Jay and I were dreamers. Like we would drive around the city and pull into parking lots at 10 o'clock at night and lay hands on multi-million-dollar buildings, believing God's going to give us this property. It was just a really, really tough season. Our life was the kingdom, and I didn't want to do anything that set my trajectory in a way that took me away from the kingdom. And so I made decisions like working multiple low-wage jobs so the church could be a priority. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, why go get a degree to get a great career? 4 years of university to get a career. 4 years from now, this church might need me. And so that was it was a kingdom first thought process because I knew the call God had on my life. It was tough, but this word comes in September of 14, and we're driving around the city looking, you know, is this the building? Is this the building that God's going to give us? We thought, we had heard testimonies of church planters being given, you know, buildings from the United Church or the Methodist Church that had declining congregations. So we thought, if we could just get in with one of these churches, rent their building, get out of the hotel, start meeting there on a Sunday, surely this is God did it for somebody in California. This is how he's going to do it for us. I'm telling you, we called probably 60 or 70 churches in our city, and not one of them would rent to us on a weekly basis. So we just stuck it out in the hotel. And in January of 16, we were using another Pentecostal church in the city, using their building on a Sunday afternoon to baptize 3 people. And as we were finishing, the pastor came over, in so many words, basically said, I'm ready to retire. My time is done. Our congregation's in decline, and I see what the Lord is doing in your church. What do you think about just taking over this? Well, I'll tell you what I think. Mm-hmm. And so that began a series of conversations amongst ourselves with this pastor, Brother Woodward, about the possibility of this. And it was a process. There were some hiccups in it. It was not without a struggle. But in the spring of 16, we signed the papers and became owners of that building at 20 Gesner Street in Halifax. It's probably, I don't know if it'd be 10 or 12,000 square feet, but a 225 feet sanctuary with classrooms and kitchens and offices.
It's a beautiful place.
And man, we rejoiced.
Do you remember who preached our first Sunday?
I sure do. This man right here, Barron preached our first Sunday in that building. 2 were more beautiful than 1. And we did a Jericho that Sunday. And so, those thoughts of will my kid ever know? Well, there was a 4.5-year-old boy, doing a Jericho with his family that Sunday, because God's faithful. It was beautiful. We moved into that building in the spring of 16 with maybe 50 to 60 people on a good day. And over the following 3 years, it was awesome. And I just don't know any other word.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
And the Lord, had brought in people to kind of help and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, God sent some strategic couples to help us. There was a young man from the church that my wife grew up in Ontario who had been on the mission field and met a girl on the mission field who was from Oregon. And they were getting married and praying about where to go. She didn't want to go home. He didn't want to go home. They didn't really feel called to full-time missions at that season of their life. And in conversation one day, she said to him, well, what about your friends that are starting that church in Halifax? And they came at such a pivotal time, right in that season of transition from the hotel to the building. We had young children. They had no kids.
yeah, it was great. And the deals.
They served us. They served Justin and Grace. They served the church body. It was such a tremendous blessing. And then there were some other couples as we moved into the building God gave us that rounded out the team and brought different gifts that certainly blessed us. But that season that began in 2016 with the miracle of that property really launched us into 3 years of, really 4 years it's continuing in the church today of perpetual growth. The Lord transitioned us out of Halifax in 2019. And
Can I just say, I remember saying to you, just wait. As soon as the church starts booming and things get comfortable, God will just push us right out of our comfort zone. And I feel like that's exactly what happened.
And that's 2019.
yeah, my last Sunday there with Pastor Jay in 2019, we had 148 people that Sunday, I think it was.
That was December, yeah.
In December of 19. And we were just privileged to do their missions weekend last fall. And they had around 250 in service that Sunday.
So awesome.
And I mean, God has blessed the church tremendously in so many ways. I heard Sister Rachel Coltharp say it at Youth Congress in 2017, and I have never forgot it. I think it was 17. But she said, God tells long stories.
Yes, he does.
And, every story has some low points, and that's what keeps you reading. And you just got to hang on and keep turning the page. So it was a remarkable journey. The transition component was unique. As all couples do, you talk about life and ministry. What's the future look like? And that season of blessing, I mean, it was almost, in fact, there was a song that came out at that time called Living the Dream. I don't recall the name of the band at the moment, but essentially he says, life is not what I thought it would be. I'm in the trenches, but I'm living the dream. And it really became my anthem, because in so many ways life was not what I wanted, but because I'm making these decisions not based on the moment or on money, but in the interest of the kingdom. In some ways, I feel like I've handicapped myself, but I really feel like I've made this decision in the fear of God.
Right.
And so,
can I ask, Hailey, how you felt during those moments? Like, from your perspective, what were some of the thought processes that you had?
Well, not even financially, but even just the balance of church life and family life in those, I'd say, middle years in Halifax was really challenging. So finding a balance between putting in the effort, because there is no way to build a church without just grit and work, hard work, and just pushing yourself. And I think finding a balance of, for me personally, pushing myself at church, yet somehow finding some balance in our home life and with our boys, that was challenging. Mm-hmm. And I think the Lord, as you'll see when we get into the next season, gave us some time while we were in Europe to kind of get some things right with our family and to sort of balance out that side of our life, because I feel like we just kind of went hard, fast for about a decade. When you've made a decision to follow the call of God, be able to do both, right? If you want to do perfect sleep training, if you want to, do it all by the book as far as parenting, you might not be able to do everything required of being involved in ministry. I'm just being honest. I mean, I think that is a level of sacrifice for my part.
We had our family ministry philosophy is we're going to do this together.
Yeah.
This is not Hailey and I, and we're going to leave the kids and figure out who can help the kid. No, we're going to do this together.
Right.
And there are going to be some nights that means you're up later than you should be. And there's going to be some weekends where that means our plans are altered. But this is just what we do together.
Right.
It's price and privilege.
And part of the sacrifice is going to be a family sacrifice. We're doing this together. I remember Raina telling us a story of you all being church planners years ago, and one of your boys saying, I gave my life for this church. And I remember laughing, and I'm thinking, yeah, sometimes preachers' kids, you got to stay late. There's a meeting. You got to stay up late. Maybe you get drive-through on the way home from church, and it's not all perfect. But I also have a kid that used to door knock in Halifax, and he's a teenager, and he is the first one that wants to hand out flyers and door knock now. So it puts something in our kids, sometimes just having to, maybe we get it right one week and maybe the next week we don't. And so maybe it's hard and we're going strong at the church one week. Well, the next week we take some time as a family to reset and to recalibrate. So I think you're right. There is times that we have to say no. And I think there's times that we just have to push on through, because I do feel like our elders, I want to say like 2 generations ago, they just gave all, and maybe at the cost of their family. But now the pendulum is swinging where people are just, so engrossed in what's going on at the home and their kids' needs. And not that that isn't important, but, if we do this together and we include the kids, like my husband said, there's going to be some depth of character that happens in them coming along and being part of what we're doing.
One of the things that we've always done with our family ever since we started the church was ensuring that they realized that the sacrifice was balanced with the reward. Mm-hmm. We let them know, and they know. Mm-hmm. Your kids know. If you're in ministry, if you're in church planning, if you're a missionary, your kids know the level of sacrifice.
Yes.
They're accustomed to it from the smallest of age up. They know they grow up within the 4 walls of your church, right? They just know that. So they're used to the sacrifice. But what we've done is we have been open about the reward. Mm-hmm. And so, hey, we're taking this vacation because your church people work very hard. Mm-hmm. And
right.
They provide for us to be able to let them know it's just not all about sacrifice, because the sacrifice is great. And you guys are talking about that. Mm-hmm. But there is a reward to this. There and not only on earth, but also spiritually speaking. Mm-hmm. When your son comes into the room and he's telling you about a dream he had, and then all of a sudden he unfolds after this dream the calling of God that's on his life,
Yeah.
and the way that he feels about that, you see there is reward to this.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not all just about sacrifice.
In those seasons of blessing, in 2016 onward, it's where it started to get good. In 2018, I went full-time with the church. And we laugh because it wasn't full-time pay, but it was full-time hours. And what better place to spend the hours of your day than doing the work of the kingdom? And Jay had gone full-time just a year ahead, so we were living the dream. And it was in this season where life seemed to be so good, where Haley would say, it's, now that it's good, you watch, God will just, he'll take us out of here. And so then in 2016, we had taken a trip that summer to Spain, and a missions trip. And when I returned home, and I don't know any other way to explain it, then there was just a discontent, not an unhappiness, because I was very happy where we were, very fulfilled, but just a discontent because I could feel, the word was transition, but I didn't know that at the time. I could feel this unsettling in my spirit that, man, where I am is not where I'm always going to be. And so we talked about it amongst ourselves. In fact, we talked about it with you and Raina, as close friends. And that was pretty much it for 14 months until the following summer. We sat with the Shocks at Youth Congress, and we had met them in passing, Terry and Melanie Shock, but really didn't know them well. And he gave me his phone number and said, if you ever need anything or if I can do anything for you, call me. So sure enough, I called him a week later, and I said, look, I need help processing this. I've been struggling with this feeling for 14 months. And he said, well, Dan, are you praying? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, if you're praying, you'd have prayed through discouragement. You'd have prayed through frustration, because this was my concern, is that I would make a move on the basis of how hard this last season had been. I didn't want to make a reckless decision out of frustration or discouragement. And he just said, well, you'd have prayed through that by now. You need to ask God to give you clarity.
And that is such an important note for our listeners, what you just said. And I think you could re-say that again so that everybody knows how important that was. Because I think there's an issue with us understanding if it's the will of God. Is it the will of God? How do I know it's the will of God? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I did not want to move out of frustration or weariness. And he said, are you praying? Yes, I'm praying. Well, you would have prayed through that by now. If it's weariness, if it's just discouragement, we're talking 14 months of prayer. God would have brought you through that. You need to change your prayer, and you need to ask God to give you clarity on what you're feeling. And I did. And I'm telling you, that unsettled feeling settled. And I knew at that moment, when my prayer changed, I knew we won't be here forever.
And it wasn't like we just took 2 missions trips in the last 14 months, and now we just want to go overseas and drink coffee on cobblestone streets. Like, it was nothing like that. It was oh my goodness, we're not feeling at home, but there's no logical reason that we'd want to go. However, when we look into the future, we just don't feel like this is it. Mm-hmm. And it was hard. It was really, honestly, we grieved. We really grieved. We grieved our friendship with the Mackenzies. We grieved the church that we loved so much and had seen God do so much is now, growing and things are happening and people are being discipled. And like, why would we want to leave that? But it was just like this. I know Jeff Arnold said it like this, but stir up the nest, mm-hmm. The mother bird is like stirring up the nest to get her little children ready to fly. And I think that's what God was doing with us.
Ministry is not saying yes to an opportunity. It's saying yes to the kingdom.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we try to minimize the kingdom to an opportunity. And did I say yes to Halifax? Absolutely. But the only reason I said yes to Halifax was because I said yes to the kingdom. And it's the principle of the open hand. God gives and God takes away. And I can open my hand and I can let him freely give and freely take, or I can be foolish and try to close my hand, and through hardship and circumstance, he can pry my fingers open and take it from me. And we're talking a feeling that began in the summer of 16 that through counsel and prayer, God gives me clarity on in the summer of 17. And we still didn't leave for another 2 years and 4 months. So there was nothing in us that was seeking to leave. I mean, sincerely, I love the city. I love the church. We were happy, but I could not deny what God was stirring in us.
And there's really the peace. There's a peace in following the will of God. And so if we would have stayed in Halifax, we wouldn't have that peace. And, I don't care if it's, in Riga, Latvia, or the cornfields of Indiana, like I'm going to go after that. Mm-hmm. And it's, we walk into your church on Sunday morning and you see that sign, the will of God at any cost. That is truly our heartbeat. We haven't got it all right, but that is our heartbeat. And so wherever he says go, we're going to go.
Mm. In the transition to Latvia, so we're talking about a feeling 3 years in the making, prayers, 2.5 years in the making, but I wouldn't move without a word. I have confirmation that there's coming a day in my future where you will transition, but I'm not seeking that out of my own will. So we're not moving without a word. Until God gives us a new word, a fresh word, we're going to live on that last word. And in September of 19, I was in Latvia ministering at their national conference. And I was in prayer in the Airbnb I was in that morning. And the Lord spoke to me. This is the place and now is the time. I was stunned. It was not the place I would have anticipated. It was not the time. But this had been 3 years in the making, and this is how we live our lives. When God speaks, we obey. And so
we set out to follow the call of God and to raise funds to go on this journey. And it was basically, we started after Christmas. So January of 2020 is when we started raising funds. So everyone can laugh now because you know what's going to happen. You start January of 2020, and by the time we get to March, every church is shut down. So that's another miracle. That's a story we should probably share.
Talk to us about it, because it is an absolute miracle how God had lined all that.
We had planned, so we left Halifax at the end of 2019, sold everything we owned, fit in the back of a vehicle with us. And our intention in doing that was, we had some debt we had accumulated through schooling and the 10 years of church planning that we needed to deal with before we were going to go overseas. So our first step was we're going to sell everything we possibly can to get out of debt, which was not enough, but I was trying to show God I'm willing to do whatever. And part of the story, going back to 10 years, our first summer in Halifax, a man prophesied to me in an altar call. And my wife had alluded to it earlier. But the second part of that word was like a seed, you'll fall into the ground and die. And the mountain of debt will be no more, and provision will come from the north, south, east, and the west. I literally live by the word. Literally. I had job offers for $100,000 a year, but I knew if I take this job, it sets the trajectory of my life and family on a course that is not the kingdom. And I walked out of job interviews, and I worked 3 jobs. I worked night shift at a hotel. I managed rental properties, and we're scraping by because I sincerely believed that there would come a moment when God would send provision from the north, south, east, and the west, and the mountain would be no more. So in this transition to Europe, I told God, I can't ask people to support me, to deal with debt. This is me and you. And you told me 10 years ago, this is what you were going to do. I'll go anywhere you want. I'll do anything you ask, but I'm asking you to fulfill this word. So I had planned 6 months of travel. We had moved our family out of Halifax. We were going to base out of my parents' basement for these 6 months just to alleviate living costs so we could hammer this debt. 6 weeks in, COVID shows up. The world shuts down. I was in Arkansas in mid-March of 2020, and Brother Woodward called and said, you really probably should get back. There's a lot of uncertainty about border closures. My family wasn't with me. So my wife had the boys with her parents in Ontario. I fly there, and we spend the next 3 months in their 2-bedroom, 1-bath townhouse on bunk beds. Haley and I are on the bottom bunk with Finn between us, and Carson and Sawyer on the top bunk. And that was our first 3 months of COVID lockdown. Talk about frustration, uncomfortable. And again, I'm wrestling as a man, as a father, but I really feel like I've made these decisions in the fear of God. In the next 60 days, the world is shut down. I'm not traveling. I'm not ministering. Churches aren't meeting. In the next 60 days, the Lord put $100,000 through our hands.
Wow.
And the incredible part is,
I'm telling you,
sorry,
it was so God. It was supernatural. It literally came from the north, south, east, and the west, all over the world. People that I hadn't talked to in 10 plus years, people that aren't even in church, people that visited our church one time 7 years before, messaging us on Facebook saying, I felt to send you money, $500.
Yes.
It was mind blowing. And for the first time in our married life, paid our tithes, gave larger offerings than we'd ever given, paid off all of our debt, and had a little bit in savings. It was God. I don't know. There's no other words than it was distinctly an act from God. People I'd never met before, people I'd never preached before, are texting me, "Is this Dan MacLeod?" "Yes, sir." A PayPal notification would go off, like $2,000. I'd never seen anything like it.
It's wild. And we even at that time, some of our student loans, the government put us in some kind of debt forgiveness program that we didn't know. And during that day, or that, I guess it was 60-day period, both of us who have completely different loans got loan forgiveness from the government for a great portion of our loan. So it was incredible.
It was a miracle. And so for me, more than the money was the fact that God gave me a promise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I literally staked my life on that word. I made life decisions that impacted my family on that single word. And God proved it. He was faithful to it. And so, we suffered, but man, God taught me a lot in that. Sure. And God has proved himself.
This is what it's about.
Yeah.
This is about yes to the kingdom. So transition us to Lafayette and then where you are now. Mm-hmm. And then I want you both to leave us with a very powerful word for our audience about how living, because Dan, you're making this statement, you're living by the word, according to that word. So finish us out with where you are now and give us this powerful statement. Both of you think about that.
It was so ironic, after navigating this transition, we landed in Europe and we're in Latvia. In our minds, I think we had resolved that if the Lord asked us to leave this church that we planted and be here, we're going to be missionaries forever. This is what it's going to be. Within a month, 2 months of arriving in Latvia, the Lord had made it very clear to me this is not forever. Before going, God had told me I would be in that country for 12 to 18 months, but I just couldn't fathom the Lord would say, leave a church you planted for 18 months. So in my mind, we'll be here for this period of time, and then we're going to another country. But by the time we had been there 2 months, I knew we're going back to North America, which is tough because people want to put definition on you.
Right.
And their inability to make sense of you can put you in a predicament. But we live for the approval of God, not the affirmation of people. And so we're in Latvia, we're serving, and in the spring of 2021, in February of 2021, I had been back in the States for a meeting, and by really just unusual circumstances, what it was, in fact, Brother Howell was flying back in from overseas to St. Louis, and his flight was messed up, and our meeting was pushed back 5 or 6 days. And so we ended up in Terre Haute, Indiana, by this unusual set of circumstances. The church had some free apartments that we could stay in for a few days. And while I'm there, the Lord speaks to me. And I call Haley, who's in Latvia with the boys, I said, Haley, this is where we're going to be. And she says, what do you mean? And I'm like, it's just what I feel from the Lord. Well, did you talk to them? Absolutely not. I just met these people. I had never met Pastor Harple before. I'd never been to Terre Haute. I didn't know anybody in the church. She's like, well, I said, Haley, all I know is that same peace that we have followed, that took us to Halifax, that brought us to Europe, I feel it here. And so I don't know when, I don't know how, I don't know what this is going to look like, which was so unique because I remember a conversation when we were in Latvia. I was on the phone with Scott Shelton, and I was saying to him, I was wrestling with these feelings that God was leading us back to North America, and I was wrestling with the opinions of people because I knew they wouldn't be able to make sense of this. Why would you leave this, go here for such a short time? And Brother Shelton said to me, he said, I'll tell you what. He said, when you step foot on that airplane to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, he said, you're saying yes to God, set some things in motion in your life that you will never see the fruit of until someday in the future when you walk in the back of a church. And he said, you're living in a blessing that's so much more than you ever imagined. He said, just remember that moment because that's what made it possible. And I feel like in many ways this was some of that. And so it was a journey to get there, and there were several hands that God used and men that God used to help facilitate us being able to be in the States, and we're forever indebted to them. But ultimately, it was our yes to God. It was that acknowledgement of this is what the Lord's saying, and we're in agreement with it, regardless of the cost, the inconvenience, whether it makes sense. And there's a peace there. There's a fulfillment. You know, we laugh we've always lived near the ocean. Halifax was the ocean. Riga was the ocean. Cities of 500,000. And now we're in Terre Haute, Indiana. It's cornfields and peas. It's not a metropolis, but we love it.
Yeah, and right down to the details. I know when we first went overseas, Carson was sad because there was no quizzing in Latvia. They didn't have any Sunday school. My kids were homeschooling, which they didn't particularly enjoy because there's not a lot of socialization with that. And then we pull into Terre Haute, and it's their first year of quizzing after several years of not doing it. And it's their first year of opening a Christian school. I'm like, God, you set it all up for us. And I'm so thankful. Like you said, when you say yes to God, God's got all the details down. He's figured it all out. And it's your best yes, the yes to God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is definitely your best yes. In Halifax, in those first 6 years, man, it was tough. I don't ever want to relive it. And there were on more than one occasion in frustration where, not because anything my wife said or did, but my wrestling as a husband and as a father, where I would say things like, you know what, Haley, maybe this isn't for us. Maybe ministry's not for us. We could go back to Fredericton, and we know what it takes to be good saints. We could be some of the best saints that church has. And I'm telling you, every time I would say it, oh man, my heart would grieve. And I would feel so convicted. And it's like these words would just echo over and over in my mind, going back to when God first called me. And I preached a message about it many years ago called Words I'll Never Forget. And that's it. It's the call. And ultimately, we live our lives in response to the call of a kingdom. We're not saying yes to a single opportunity. We're just saying yes to the kingdom. Whatever that costs, however inconvenient it may be. And yeah, there's some low points and there's some tough chapters. There's some discouraging seasons in the story, but just hang on because he tells long stories. And if this chapter is not good, just wait a little while and keep reading. Let him write, and the next one will be. And so, the summary of our lives is just that we're just saying yes to whatever God wants.
Truly, the scriptures are proper and right, and if we'll allow him to be the author and the finisher of our faith. What an experience Thank you for taking us on your journey today.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Bottom Half is Red. Listen, I hope you have enjoyed your time with us today and gained something of value. If you love what you heard today, please do not forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. This helps us. Your feedback is incredibly crucial, and we want to improve on what we're doing and to bring you the best content possible. You can find us on Facebook, look us up, Instagram, even YouTube at The Bottom Half is Red. Hey, be sure to check the episode description for any links to any resources that we have mentioned during the show. You don't want to miss out. This podcast is a production of The Church Today here in the great city of Tulsa, and the executive producer is our very own David Tandera. I hope you've had a fantastic time, and we look forward to having you with us again on our next episode of The Bottom Half is Red. We'll see you then.